Hello, and welcome to this episode of History Matters, the podcast of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. My name is Alan Williams, and my guest today is David Wilson, Professor of Celtic Studies and History at the University of Toronto, author of the definitive 2-volume biography of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and, more recently, Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police, published by McGill-Queen's University Press in 2022. And since 2013, David has been the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. We're recording this conversation in Toronto on November 6th, 2025. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's great to be here.
Well, that's great to have you with us, and I look forward to our conversation. I wanted to open with, I was reading your bio on your website, and I thought it would be worth reading the opening paragraph. So let me just start with that. David, it says, was born in Island McGee, County Antrim, Ireland, in a farmer's cottage without electricity or running water, and thus establishing himself as a true Celt. David moved with his family to England, where he resisted education in a variety of schools before being fired as a bus conductor, living in a commune in Cardiff, and hitchhiking in Western Europe. Going to the University of York, dropping out, and going again, he eventually received his BA and emigrated to Canada, completing his MA and PhD at Queen's University. Well, that's quite an opening paragraph, David. I guess my question to you is, after a youth like that, why did you decide to come to Canada?
Well, good question. It was because my parents emigrated. When I was at the University of York in England, my parents emigrated to Deep River, Ontario. And in the summer of 1972, they paid my way to Canada. It was the first warm summer I'd ever experienced in my life. I loved it. I also went out the following winter and decided I could handle the cold. And so when I finished my university degree at University of York in England, I thought, well, I'll come to Canada, I'll work for a year, and I'll apply for universities here. And I wound up at Queen's as a result, which was a very, very good decision. There's always an element of luck, but I fell on my feet by going to Queen's because they had a fantastic history department.
Yes. So when you were at York, was there any study of Canadian history there, or was it some other aspect of history?
None whatsoever. I would say everything but Canadian history, in fact. So I came to graduate school at Queen's knowing no Canadian history and very prudently decided not to take any Canadian history courses because I knew I'd be at a huge disadvantage compared to the other students if I did that. And I always had a very clear goal in mind for my graduate work and my PhD, which became my first book. And that was to do something on Anglo-American radicalism and populist conservatism during the American and French revolutions. Very broad field, but I worked within that. So while I was at Queen's, my supervisor, George Rawlick, who worked a lot on Canadian-American relations and who was an expert in colonial American history, also had within the colonial Americans, of course, some readings on early Canadian history, sort of 17th, 18th century Canadian history. So that was my introduction. But really, Alan, I knew next to nothing about Canadian history for the longest time. And I remember when I went for my citizenship exam, rather, and everyone had told me, oh, don't worry, it's a very easy exam. Just don't say Toronto is the capital of Canada, you'll be all right. So I did no research whatsoever for it. And I remember the magistrate asking me to name the 4 provinces that joined Confederation in 1867. And I had no idea. So I said, well, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and I got a real telling off, accompanied by a lecture about the declining standards of university education if a graduate student in history didn't know something as basic as that. By the way, I then asked the magistrate, in all innocence, when did Manitoba join Confederation? Just out of interest, and she didn't know what's that side. But I started. Actually, I was thrown in at the deep end. Really, I went to St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, on a 1-year fellowship while I was still doing my PhD. And it involved teaching. It involved teaching a course on Canadian history, and I was just thrown into that. And so I got Kenneth McNaught's Pelican History of Canada, and I sort of almost memorized that. I was, half a step ahead of the students. Fortunately for me, most of the students in Canton, New York, didn't know anything about Canadian history either. It's a little like the blind leading the blind. But I gradually learned more. I gradually saw more. And when I got back to Queens, and still I was working on my PhD, I was offered a 2-year sessional, a contractually limited term appointment, which involved British and Irish history and Canadian history. And again, my PhD got postponed because I spent a lot of time working on Canadian history. And after that, actually, even though my PhD was a completely different area, after that, I got a 2-year position at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where they asked me to teach a course on Canadian social history, as well as a general course on Canadian history. So it was a bit like, rent a course. If anyone asked me to do a course in any field, I would say yes. And then I would do my best to make sure that the students got the best possible education. I mean, I love teaching and I love new challenges. And boy, did I get a lot of new challenges at that time. So it was almost, Alan, by accident that I got into Canadian history. And then I was my next couple of books were on transatlantic history with reference to America. I wrote a book on Irish radicals in early Republican America, United Irishmen, United States, and then got into the Celtic Studies program and began to focus again more on Irish and Irish diasporic history. But then while I was there, I thought it'd be very interesting to switch from Irish American history to Irish Canadian history, and I'd worked with Don Akenson at Queen's. He wasn't my supervisor, but Don Akenson is one of the world's greatest experts on Irish diasporic history. And also he wrote some groundbreaking books on the Irish in Canada. So I had a very good basis there. And so from that, I decided to write a biography of Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And it was intended to be a 250-page sort of general study based on primary sources, and it was such a fascinating topic that covered so many elements of 19th century history, from constitutional nationalism to revolutionary nationalism to religious conservatism to liberalism to Fenian revolutionaries to Orange counter-revolutionaries. All in the context of revolution and famine in Ireland, civil war in the United States, Confederation in Canada, by which time I did know which 4 provinces joined. And it was that book, actually, what turned into 2 volumes. It was a book I always wanted to write because my other books had been written while I also had a very heavy teaching load. This 2-volume study of D'Arcy McGee, I was able to focus on much more. And, it won some major prizes, which I'd never anticipated, which was an absolute thrill for me. And as a result of that biography, of an Irish Canadian politician, for some people, the Irish Canadian politician, I was invited to become general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. And I have to say, initially, I was reluctant to take the position because, I didn't feel I was properly qualified for it.
Well, let me just cut you off there just to say, I think we should have a separate episode with you to talk about the D'Arcy McGee books. And I can say that they have been reviewed on the CIHE website, an excellent review by Sean Conway. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. So let's focus on that a little bit. I understand that it resulted from a donation by an immigrant from the UK who saw that there was a similar dictionary in England, but no such thing in Canada. So do you want to tell us a little bit about James Nicholson and how that got started?
Yes, it's the most unlikely story. History is full of unlikely stories. I mean, he was a birdseed manufacturer. So the DCB was floated on birdseed money. And as you say, he was a great admirer of the Dictionary of National Biography in the UK. He was an avid reader. The story about his youth is that he would actually go without food to buy books at times. And yes, indeed, he thought there was a real opportunity here. He wanted to contribute to the country that had done so much for him as an English immigrant. And so he not only gave us a donation, which got the DCB going, but he also stipulated some broad guidelines about how it should operate, including the insistence that it didn't just deal with the good and the great, but that it included Canadians from all walks of life who had a significant impact on the country. And we've been true to that directive ever since. And you know, when I was a graduate student, Alan, I had this very stereotypical view of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography without really knowing much about it, because I just assumed that it was full of politicians and leading businessmen, men, and wealthy ones at that. And I was very interested in social history from the ground up, and I thought the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, almost by definition, would exclude such people. Well, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the DCB has a phenomenal track record of dealing with people who range from Newfoundland fishers to farmers and prairies to public hangmen to cult leaders and to the movers and shakers in society as well, who, of course, should absolutely be there. So it's a very broad church.
Well, so Sidney Smith was, I guess, the guy who got the ball rolling at the University of Toronto. And one of the questions that he and his team would have had to address was what format should the dictionary take? So could it be thematic, or should it be chronological, or and can you talk about how they addressed that question and where they landed on it?
Indeed. I mean, there were considerable discussions about that, and it was decided that it would proceed in a chronological fashion, sort of decade by decade almost. So that's what transpired. It began with, I think the first volume goes from 1000, the arrival of Vikings, basically, and went up to the early New French period. And after that, it would go decade by decade by decade, in the publishing process. So that worked well when we had print volumes. But it became increasingly anachronistic, in my view, as general editor, as we moved into the digital world, because we had opportunities here that we could pursue that would not otherwise have been open to us had we stayed along a strictly chronological pattern. So after many discussions, we're a bilingual operation, with many discussions with our counterparts in Quebec, we decided that it was about 3 years ago now, half of our new biographies, would continue along chronological lines, which actually takes us now into the 1940s. But the other half would be wide open to go back to people we'd missed, or back to people about whom very little sources were available, for whom very few sources were available, in the 1970s and 1980s, but who now we've been able to locate sources that have enabled us to write biographies of them. And also we can fast forward to people such as Donald Creighton and Pierre Trudeau and so on, which of course we've done. That happened before the official switch, but we now are much more flexible about who we can include in the dictionary.
So am I right that the completed, in a sense, volumes go up to the end of, I guess, to 1940 or to 1939, but that you also have people, some anyway, who are whose death occurred later than 1939 now?
Yes, absolutely, we do. And I said, well, I should add also, Alan, that we no longer have print volumes. We're now entirely online.
Right. And how do you decide to, like someone who died, say, in the 80s or 90s or in the 2000s, what are the criteria to decide which of those people you would have a biography of?
Well, I think it's done actually pretty much on an ad hoc basis. So, for example, if there's an historian who's written a really good biography of someone, and the sources that person have used are really excellent, then why not ask that person to write a biography of someone who died in the 1980s or 1990s? Why not do that? But we have to be very careful about it too, because there's huge demand from people who would love to have biographies of individuals studying. They would love to have them in the DCB, and of course, our resources are finite. Believe me, they're finite.
The resources.
Yes.
Yeah. Where in fact does the money come from? Other than the original grant, where does the money to pay for the dictionary come from?
Right. We get $1 million a year through the Canadian Museum of History, funded by the department that used to be known as Heritage and is now the Ministry of Canadian Culture and Identity. And we also apply every 3 years directly to the Heritage Department, or now Canadian Identity Department, for money related to specific projects. And that gives us a significant addition to the 1 million we get. And then we get donations.
Okay.
And we're actually in the middle of a major fundraising drive, which is being led by Margaret Macmillan and her brother Tom Macmillan and Tony Thel. We face a very difficult financial future unless we can raise $10 million. We've been given a flat rate from the government of $1 million a year, which we're grateful for, but that rate hasn't changed since the 1990s. And it's now worth, in 1990s term, about 1.5 million. And our costs have increased. So we're currently surviving on accumulated royalties from the past, but the lines cross in 2 years' time. And we are not allowed to go into debt at the University of Toronto. So we would be faced with some terrible decisions. We would have to curtail our operations, lay off staff, and this would be devastating because in this world of disinformation, in which we're all sort of awash in a sea of propaganda, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography provides this balanced, authoritative, readable, accessible, freely accessible source for Canadian history. And I should add, actually, that the goal of the dictionary is not to celebrate Canadian history, but nor is it to join the bandwagon of those who condemn Canadian history. The goal of the dictionary is to understand Canadian history in all its complexity.
That might be a good jumping off point to. I wanted to ask about some of the biographies that would have been written back in the early days, even in the 50s maybe, but certainly in the 60s and 70s. the perspectives of historians and of Canadians may have changed in the intervening years. What do you do about biographies that need to be updated to account for changing circumstances? And I know that you have spoken about, for example, the process of updating the biography of Sir John A. Macdonald. But let me just turn it over to you to say in general how you do it and how you would maybe talk about Macdonald too.
Certainly. I mean, one of the first issues that I confronted as general editor was shifting language. So, people known as Indians are now known as indigenous peoples, or even sort of specific First Nations groups. And the word savages appears in quite a lot of the early volumes. If the word savages is in quotation marks, it will not be touched. But if words such as squaw or Eskimo or savage are being used, or if mentally defective is being used as well, that kind of thing, or dumb for someone who is mentally challenged, then we made the changes, but we were always clear about making the changes. We were insistent. When I say we, I mean my counterpart in Quebec and myself. We were insistent that we were open about what we were doing, and we would not fall victim to a kind of Orwellian rewriting of history. You can always see the original biography. You can check the original Macdonald biography as well if you want. It's not just a question of changing words in biographies. We always let people know what we're doing and why we're doing it. So transparency is crucial. On the specific case of Macdonald, we had a first-class biography of Macdonald, but it was very much a product of its time. And if you wanted to know about Macdonald's indigenous policies, you wouldn't find anything there. And if you wanted to know anything about Macdonald, you find very little. You wouldn't find much. And on Chinese exclusion, nothing. So this needed to change. And so we were faced with a challenge here, because rewriting the whole biography, which I think is somewhere in the region of 28,000 words, one of our biggest biographies, would have been a massive undertaking that would have swallowed up all our resources. And the existing biography was in many respects excellent. So what we decided to do was bring in two experts. And the choice of person is crucial here. We needed people who are well-established, balanced, thoughtful experts in the field. And we were very lucky to get two of them. Jim Miller, who yes, I think will be familiar to people in CIG, on Macdonald's indigenous policies, and Patricia Roy on Macdonald's policies towards Chinese immigrants. And so they added supplemental material, and we're very clear in the online version, which is the only version, as to where and when the supplemental material comes in. So you can distinguish between material that was written by the original authors. J.K. Johnson was one of them. And the name of the other's gone right out of my head, but a very well-known historian and a lovely man. So you can distinguish between what they wrote and what Patricia Roy and Jim Miller wrote. So we did that. And then there was a question about the conclusion of the biography, because the previously existing conclusion jarred with some of the new material. So we decided to rewrite the conclusion, and I did that myself.
I see.
That was one of the most challenging. It's only about four paragraphs, but it's one of the most challenging pieces of writing that I've ever done, because it forced me to be crystal clear about how you could be balanced on this, how you could assess Macdonald in all his complexities, all his strengths, all his weaknesses within the context of his times. while doing justice to the original biography and doing justice to what Patricia Roy and Jim Miller added. So I actually did what any self-respecting historian would do under those circumstances. I just put it off as long as possible. And one evening, I thought, "Oh, screw this! I just got to have a crack at it." And it all came out in one go. Clearly, it had been percolating in the mind for a long time. It all came out, and then it needed to be fine-tuned. And I ran it by people like Gary Friesen, who gave very, very good constructive criticism, and others. And this was, he was a great help. Others were a great help. And finally, we settled on what we have. And then we sat back and we waited for the attacks that we thought would come from the right and the left. And they so far have not materialized, which is a pleasant surprise.
Well, it sounds like you've done a good job of telling both sides of a story there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, who would you say the dictionary is aimed at in terms of an audience? Is it just any curious Canadian, or is it students, or is it professional historians, and what about high school kids? Is it age appropriate for high school students too?
To answer the last part of your question first, in some ways, there's some biographies, but the problem with high school history is that it's generally only taught grade 9 level, right? Certainly in Ontario. So, you're 14 years old when you're doing Canadian history. And there are some biographies that will work for 14-year-olds. So some will, for sure. But most won't, to be quite honest. I mean, they're pitched at a higher level. They're meant to be accessible, and I hope they are. They're basically aiming at an educated audience who are keen to learn more about Canada's past. The general public, for sure, but in practice, it's people who have a rough eye. People who would at least know that there was Confederation in 1867, even if they couldn't name the 4 provinces. So that kind of but it's used by so many people. It's used by genealogists. It's used by researchers. We keep getting positive feedback from people who've used the dictionary in the writing of their books, their articles, and you check out our website, www.biography. That's biographi.com. Check it out and go to the search engine and use the search engine. Type in whatever you want from Canadian history, certainly before the 1940s, and you're likely to find it there. You want to know about something like where and when was the Orange Order incorporated? You'll find it there.
All right.
People, and precisely because we're following James Nicholson's recommendation or insistence that we include people from all walks of life, if you're a professor setting an essay on the Doukhobors, you send the students to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and they will learn stuff that blows their minds.
And you will always list other sources too that they can go to.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, this is great. We have spoken for a few minutes about the DCB. I wanted to turn just very quickly. We've only got a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about your most recent book, Canadian Spy Story, which I have to say is a really interesting and entertaining read. And I think it's a story that isn't very well known, and we like to promote Canadian stories here. So it may not be fair to ask you to do this, but could you give in a nutshell what the story is about the Fenians and Macdonald and so on?
Certainly. So the Fenians are generally regarded in Canada as an external threat. An invasion force who received very little support within Canada, if any. And while working on the D'Arcy McGee biography, it became increasingly apparent to me that there was a as it became apparent to McGee himself, that there was a significant Fenian underground in Canada. It's a minority of Irish Catholics, but a significant minority. Probably around a quarter of them sympathized with the Fenians or joined the Fenian Brotherhood. And they were divided between those who wanted to focus on Ireland and those who supported an invasion of Canada. And it's a fascinating story. And then the sources that allow us to open up this world come largely from secret, although not exclusively, but largely from secret policemen. And the Canadian Secret Police was formed initially during the Civil War to prevent incursions from Canada to the United States. But as it became increasingly apparent that Fenians in the United States were planning incursions into Canada, it shifted its focus. And as I've mentioned in many of my talks, there are some 3,000 letters in Macdonald's papers from detectives in the field to their handlers to Macdonald and back down the chain. 3,000. Anyone who says the Fenians didn't matter or were a joke or a comic opera needs to keep that number in mind.
A couple of questions.
So that's what I was working on.
All right. A couple of quick questions that come out of that is my recollection from hearing you talk about this before is that your sense was that possibly no historian had looked at those 3,000 letters before. Well,
no historian had looked at them in detail. Some good work had been done by Greg Keeley in an opening chapter of his book, which is based on an article that he wrote. And there was an MA thesis at Queen's on the financing of the secret police that had some material, but no one had gone systematically through these 3,000 letters. No, and it was a gold mine, an absolute treasure trove. And one of the most interesting things that came out of it concerning Macdonald is that he deliberately downplayed the internal Fenian presence in Canada, and I'd inferred that from various writings. And then I found a letter in Macdonald's papers in which he explicitly says this, which is fascinating, remarkable, and instructive. And he downplayed it.
Publicly, you mean?
Pardon?
Publicly, you mean?
Publicly,
yes.
Absolutely.
Like he didn't downplay it in terms of realizing that there was an issue to deal with. He just tried to keep it under the radar.
That's right. Fair? He said, as you'll know from reading the book, he said they've gone to a much greater extent than anyone realizes, but I've tried to say as little about it as possible, because he was afraid of generating a Protestant orange backlash that result in ethnic religious polarization, and also because he was trying to win the Catholic vote, and was playing his cards very carefully. He didn't want to alienate moderate Catholics, non-Fenian Catholics, or even ambivalent Catholics. And actually, as soon as he realized after 1870 that the Fenians were no longer going to be a direct threat to Canada, he was quite willing to work with former Fenian editors or buy them out, not buy out their newspapers, but to buy them so they become conservative supporters, as some indeed did. So all of this, I think, is a very interesting aspect of Macdonald's response. In marked contrast, I should say, to his response to the Plains Cree indigenous peoples after the Frog Lake massacre, he deliberately exaggerated the role of the Cree in the Riel resistance of 1885. And again, I could read you the direct quotation. We know he exaggerated it because in his private correspondence, he said he exaggerated that, and he did it deliberately so that it would show to the quote, almost word for word, show to the red man that the white man rules. So no sentences were commuted for the 11, I think it was, Cree who were sentenced to death, whereas all the sentences had been commuted for the Fenians who'd been sentenced to death. And again, pragmatism is a large part of that, because had Macdonald allowed those executions of Fenians to go through, much against the advice of the British government, who were horrified at the prospect that that might happen. It would have seriously damaged Anglo-American relations and would probably have precipitated another raid from the Fenians into Canada. But no such considerations applied to the Cree.
Yes. Well, it shows that everyone's legacy is complex.
Indeed, it does exactly that. And I think we need to get away from good guys, bad guys stuff here. I mean, right. Complexity should be our starting point, not our conclusion.
Yes. Well, it's a fascinating book. It's Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police, published by McGill-Queen's University Press in 2022. So I'd like to thank you for telling us about it, David. I'd like to close in the couple of minutes we have left by two questions for you. We heard about your a little bit about your youth and your early studies, but what got you interested in history in the first place when you were in the in Ireland and then in England?
I think I've spoken to so many other people who say the same thing. A mentor. The way history was taught to me in grammar school, high school equivalent, was dreadful. I hated the subject. It was boring. Same time, I would go to the local newspaper office in a small town in the north of England and read the newspapers from the 1890s and 1900s and be absolutely
fascinating.
I do that on a Saturday afternoon, but that wasn't history. History was, in 1789, there was a revolution in France. Write it down over and over again. That was history. But when I went to the University of York, people told me about this professor who was such a dynamic lecturer that even though people weren't taking his courses, they would go to hear him. And I thought, well, I have to check this out. And it was like scales falling off my eyes. Suddenly history became about human beings. It became about really serious issues, connecting the political and the personal. The lectures were full of ironic humor, which wasn't imposed on the material, but drawn out of the material. The speaker had a terrible stammer, and he was also about just under 5 feet tall, a Welsh Marxist, Gwyn Hay Williams. And he was the best speaker to this day I have ever heard. I was spellbound, and I thought, if this is history, I want more of it.
Oh, what a great story. Well, thank you for telling us about that. Last question, David. What book or books would you recommend to our audience, to our listeners, as a way to connect them with history?
Well, I'm glad you said books, because it's very hard to select one. And, I'm fascinated by biography, and there are a couple of biographies that I would recommend, and then another book that I really like. And the biographies are actually John English's biography of Pierre Trudeau, which I think is just a great read. These books had to be well written, they had to be well written as well as being well researched. That certainly is. And the other biography is Don Wright's biography of Donald Creighton.
Donald Creighton.
And I have a lot of time for Don Wright, as former president of the Canadian Historical Association, who's a magnificent writer and a great researcher. But I feel this is a bit like Desert Island Discs. The book that I would choose to keep on the island would be not a very well-known one, but one that should be well-known. It's not well-known because it's written about women in the Avalon Peninsula between 1750 and 1860. And that is not a mainstream topic.
No.
It's by William Keogh. It's called A Slender Thread. And it is a brilliant piece of social history. Absolutely brilliant. That opens up a world that had been completely lost to historians, but not to people in the Avalon Peninsula.
So William Keogh.
Keogh. That's Keough.
A Slender Thread. Yes. And approximately when was that written?
Oh, I have to check, but it's as an historian, I always lose track of time, but I would say somewhere around 2012, perhaps, would be my guess.
So it's comparatively recent.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
I shudder if I go back and look and see it's 1990, but I think it's about 2012.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for being with us today. If you like what you heard today, subscribe to History Matters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. You can reach me or the members of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education by email at info@cihe.ca.